These are salutation verse from Abhisamaya Lankara. Salutation verses from the wisdom verses of the middle way. I prostrate to the perfect Buddha, the best of teachers, all who taught that which arises through dependent relationship is without cessation, without arising, without annihilation, without permanence, without coming, without going, without distinction, without identity, and peaceful, free from fabrications. So here in Latvia today we have the teaching is mainly for those people who have come from Russia. The reason is Buddhism is one of the state-recognized religions of the Federation of Russia. And we have within the Russian Federation, Kalmykia, Buryat, and Tuva, who people who were following Buddhism as their traditional religion, particularly the Buddhism that has spread to Tibet. And so when I was a child, there were hundreds of students of philosophy and Buddhist philosophy in Tibet. And so for many centuries, over maybe we may say over 1,000 years, we have this connection between the Buddhists within the Russian Federation and Tibet. And therefore, I'm here to explain give teaching on Buddhism and explain the text that we are going to go through. Whereas in the West, of course, I do explain about psychology, mind, emotions in the West, which are academic subjects. And recently, I was in Germany and met with scientists, and we had discussions on philosophy and science of mind. And I do not try to explain Buddhism as such in these areas, because different countries and different regions have their own ancestral, traditional religions, and therefore I always consider it better for those people in the West to keep to their own tradition, because of the complications that happens to people. There may be problems people would face. So some Westerners who came to India and then tried to convert themselves to Buddhism, but later on they had complications, and therefore it's better for people to keep to their own traditional religious traditions. I have Father Wayne. I knew a Christian father, Father Wayne, who was very interested in Buddhism. So we were very good friends, and we shared teachings on love, tolerance, and also compassion, and also single-pointed meditation. One day he asked me about emptiness, and I told him, "Don't ask that question. This is not your business. This is a unique philosophical concept of Buddhism." And so I frankly told him, because we were very close to each other, I frankly told him, because the reason is that when we talk about dependent origination, everything is dependently arisen. We need to talk about all things being like an illusion, and therefore I thought that thinking about emptiness might hinder his own belief in an absolute God. And therefore, it's better to stay within one's own traditional religion. But amongst the thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands and millions of people in the different countries, there, of course, may be people with disposition to the teaching of the Buddha. And so those may be exceptions. And so people could take interest in Buddhism, and having taken interest in Buddhism, they find Buddhism to be more suitable to them. And the traditional religion may not be so effective, they feel, not so effective for them. And therefore, even in such cases, it's a different, it's an exception that they could, that they take up Buddhism as their religion. But while doing so, they must not disrespect their own traditional religion, because the traditional religion in the West, Judeo-Christian religions, have been really beneficial to their followers. And then in this hall also, there may be people who are traditional Buddhists, and then those who are new to Buddhism. But we need to always keep respect to our traditional religions, your traditional religions. I personally do respect all religions. So through mutual respect amongst the religious traditions, it's very important for us to develop harmony amongst the different religions in today's world. It is very unfortunate that we have people engaging in killing other people in the name of religion. In Tibet also, there were fightings amongst the different religious traditions between red hat and yellow hat sect and so forth. And so these are really unfortunate. And so this, of course, happens in other regions. And so even if you may have adopted Buddhism as your religion, you should still respect your own traditional religion. And so the question here about religion is, what does religion mean? We are in the 21st century, in a period where there is very high advancements in science and technology. And so we need to explain whether religion is something relevant or not today. Do we need religion in today's world? Of course, there are many intellectuals and many institutions, academic institutions, but most of the learning and education that we have today are more or less oriented towards that of the faith, those of the material development alone. And then with regard to religions, most of the religions also are based on faith alone. Whereas in India, we have tradition of making transformation in our mind. So that doesn't mean we should have new kinds of mind as such, but the very mind that we have now, which is full of all these negative thoughts and emotions, and then chain reaction within them, within ourselves, and we need to transform this from within, not through some prayer or not through some blessings, but through critical thinking. And so how do we do that is with regard to anger, arrogance, and pride, and also self-centered attitude. And there is this grasping and attachment to oneself, very strong attachment to oneself. And these causes disturbance in our mind. And so on the one hand, it's caused by the self-attachment. And then on the other hand, we make this distinction between enemies and those of adversaries and our friends, and then have all these emotional reactions. So in other words, religion teaches the practice of love and compassion. Even in the case of theistic religions, those believers in the Creator God also teach in order to strengthen the practice of love and compassion. There is teaching of tolerance, forgiveness, contentment, and so forth. And so all these different religious traditions are the practice to reduce, at least to those of our negative emotions like anger and hatred and so forth. So the educational system, which is more or less oriented towards the material development, cannot actually cause this transformation within ourselves to overcome our negative emotions like anger, attachment, and so forth. Of course, people do find some relief from by taking drugs, tranquilizers, and so forth, but cannot transform our mind, overcome our anger, and so forth. So the existing modern education system is more or less oriented towards those of the material development. Modern education, of course, started in the West, and through the development of technology and science, when they began in the West, the religious institutions were the educational institutions as well in the beginning. But then as science and technology, arithmetic and so forth developed further and further, and there's this technological advancement, so the religious traditions, the religious institutions, which were the educational institutions in the beginning, didn't become sufficient, and therefore the educational institutions separately developed in the West. And so with regard to the taking care of the inner world of our mind, it was left to the religious institutions, and the rest of the fields of learning, like arithmetic and so forth, were left to the educational institutions that developed separately from the religious institutions. And as time went by, as people lost faith in religion more and more, then the religious traditions impact or influence on people with regard to teaching morality and so forth was not sufficient. And the educational institutions themselves did not have any education on morality, ethics, and therefore, in modern existing education lacks the teaching on moral principles and love and compassion. So, of course, in order to fix this problem, religion alone cannot cover all 7 billion people. And because over 1 billion people of the 7 billion are the non-believers. And so because they do not believe in religion, religion cannot affect them. And then amongst the religions, religious people, practitioners of different religions, there are people who who are not convinced of the religious messages that are in their religious traditions. And therefore, there is this problem of even going to the length of killing other human beings in the name of religion. And therefore, to cover all the 7 billion people on this earth, we need a system of teaching, which is the secular teaching of secular ethics, which existed in India for thousands of years. So secularism in India is understood in the sense of respecting religious traditions as well as non-believers. So this is how secularism is understood in India, whereas in the West, secularism has a connotation of disrespect or distance from the religious tradition. And during the French Revolution and Bolshevik revolution, there has been opposition to religion. But of course, if you think closely, these are not so much as we cannot say that they are against religion as such, but the religious organizations. So, because religions teach love and compassion, and no human being would oppose love and compassion. So, religious institutions were the ones that they actually were against these two revolutions. So the social system that was in place in those days was feudal system, and therefore the religious institutions have also some hands they have influence over those rulers. And so in French Revolution, the religious institution was opposed, and also Bolshevik Revolution. So we need to differentiate between the religious institutions and the teachings of the religions and see them separate. So in Tibet also, the religion was, we almost also used the religion as a means to oppress people. So the people who were in power, the landlords, because they have connection with the religious institutions which were supporting them, backing them, and therefore during the revolutions, the two revolutions, the French and Bolshevik revolutions, there is this also the kind of it seems that the people were against religion also when they were opposing the feudal lords. So therefore, in the West, secularism has this connotation of being against religion, whereas in India, secularism doesn't have that connotation. Secularism is understood to respect religion as well as those who have no religious belief. For example, the Charvakas were the ones who were materialists. And those who were practitioners and followers of this tradition in India were, of course, their philosophical idea was criticized, but the practitioners themselves were respected as being rishis or sage. And this is the understanding of secularism, respecting believers as well as non-believers in India. And then Indian constitution itself is based on secularism. So over 1 billion people today are without any religious belief today, and it is said that over about 6 billion people are with religion. Although the people do say that they follow this or that religion, but they are not sincerely following their religious tradition through conviction, gaining conviction in their teachings. And so we have been working on teaching secular ethics in secular school systems today. And therefore, in America, we have Emory University, who have been working on drafting a curriculum for teaching secular ethics. And then also in India, the Tata Institute of Social Sciences and others are involved in this kind of project, making curriculum on secular ethics. And so generally speaking, 6 billion people, about 6 billion people say they are religious, follower of this or that religion. And within the religious religions, there are the two camps: one theistic religions and non-theistic religion. On the other hand, so in India, in Hinduism, for example, many different kinds of Hinduism believe in a creator God. So originally, everything was created by God, but then they also believe in past and future lives. So there are homegrown religions in India, which are theistic, and then also in the West, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are theistic religions. The believer of one creator God, and we are created just this life. So this is also very good, because when you ask what God is, the people say, the followers say that God is infinite love, an embodiment of love. And so the Creator, when it is said that the Creator is an embodiment or infinite love, we are like children of that God. So the God is like our parent, and since God is the embodiment of love and compassion, and therefore, when we say that we are created by God, such a God, it gives us this inspiration to follow the will of God, to practice love and compassion. And so to follow God or the will of God means you need to practice love and compassion, not through the practice of by being angry. And so, therefore, these theistic religions are, if you sincerely practice them, you will really find them beneficial, because they are based on the practice of love and compassion. And so, of course, all these theistic religions have been beneficial to us for so long until now.
1 billion.
So we have 1 billion Christians, and also about a billion, over a billion Muslims, and also Hindus. Maybe there are 7 or 8 100 million, and so in China, of the 1 point something billion people, there are 400 million Buddhists today in China. And so China becomes the most populated Buddhist, the communist country with the most population of Buddhists. And so we have many different religious traditions in the world today. And then with regard to the non-theistic religions, the first one would be the Sankhya school, which evolved around 3,000 years ago. And then within, of course, Sankhya school, there are two groups. One is theistic, the other non-theistic. So with regard to non-theistic, we're talking about, there is this sect within Sankhya. And then about 2,600 to 700 years ago, we had that of the Mahavira appeared in India, and therefore we have the Jainism. And around that time, Mahavira appeared at a time when there was so much sacrifice of animals, animal sacrifice in India, and therefore it also affected the economy of the farmers, and therefore the Mahavira emphasized non-violence and also taking to vegetarianism. And so this also has some connection with the social milieu at that time. So many of the practices of Buddhism and Jainism are very similar. And then with regard to Buddhism, usually I say that the Buddha, after his enlightenment, after he became enlightened, of course he was initially living in a royal family, and then seeing the facts of life, such as suffering of aging, sickness, death, and so forth, then he renounced his royal life and became an ascetic. And then through his practice, arduous practice, he became finally enlightened. So this is the general belief, according to the general understanding and perception of people at that time. And so, of course, in order to show that in order to become enlightened, we need to work hard, go through hardships, and therefore the Buddha went through the 6-year austerity practice. And during that time, during that 6-year period, he was practicing the different meditative absorptions. And of course, it was not sufficient to become enlightened just by following the shared path, the path which is shared with non-Buddhist traditions as such. And therefore, of course, the Buddha, having gone through, trained himself in the past lives, he had the imprints from past lives. And therefore, he finally went under the Bodhi tree, where he became enlightened. And as he became enlightened, he said, I found this nectar-like dharma, which is profound, peaceful, so he said, I have found this dharma, which is profound, peaceful, without fabrication, and luminous and non-compounded. And this is like a nectar. But if I were to teach it to others, explain it to others, nobody will be able to comprehend it, and nobody will be able to take it. And so this is true because at that time, the different traditions that were already existing in India, they were believing in a self separate from the psychophysical aggregates. And they do also assert past and future lives. And so with regard to the agent, which comes from the previous life to the past life to the present, and to go from this to the future life, they say there is a self or an Atman which if this Atman were to be the body or the mind, I mean, we cannot say that this body can go to the next life or come from the past life. And therefore, they said that they came up with this idea of an Atman, which is not the mind or the body in this life, but a permanent, single, and an autonomous, not dependent on the body, psychophysical aggregates, but an independent self. So this was asserted, posited by the non-Buddhist tradition, and therefore, because this was prevalent view in the culture at that time when the Buddha appeared, and therefore, if the Buddha were to teach people there's no self, no such an independent, single and permanent self, and nobody will be able to believe him. Therefore, he said, even if I were to teach it to others, nobody will understand it. And then, as time went by, the first 5 human disciples who were known to the Buddha even before he became enlightened, according to the popular account, and therefore, after becoming enlightened, the Buddha was requested by these 5 human disciples to give teaching, and therefore, the Buddha gave the first teaching in Varanasi, the teaching on which was the teaching on the 4 Noble Truths. And so there is 4 Noble Truths: the suffering, origin of suffering, true cessation, and true path. Each have their 4 characteristics. So impermanence, in the case of the truth of suffering, we have the 4 aspects which are impermanence, suffering, and so forth. And then there are 4 each of these other 3 noble truths. And so the 4 aspects or characteristics of the first noble truth are teachings which go against the wrong notions of such as permanence and bliss or pleasure, pleasant experience of samsara and so forth. And then we have the 4 mindfulness, the establishment of mindfulness practices. The mindfulness of body leads to the understanding of the suffering, truth of suffering, and then the mindfulness of those of the feeling leads to the understanding of this truth of origin, and then mindfulness of mind leading to that of the understanding of the true cessation and so forth. And so in Pisa, University of Pisa, I had discussions with scientists, biological scientists, neuroscientists, and so forth, who were explaining the mind on the basis of the brain. And so there's not much explanation of the mind that the scientists could explain apart from the brain. And so, which means they are more or less based on some coarse matter to explain mind. And then in terms of the quantum physics, they do say that there's no objective existence in things. and events. And even the Chittamatra philosophical assertion is that there is no externality of things to things, but the reason that they give is that if you go down to the subtle particles which make up the matters, you cannot actually have any subtle particle outside. And therefore, this is very similar to what the quantum physicists are saying, that things have no objective existence. And then they also say that things are called mental constructs. And Chittamatra also say that both the object, such as the blue, color blue, and the perception of blue arise simultaneously. So as long as there is the perception, there is the perceived blue color. And so the blue is mere reflection of the perception itself. And so the quantum physicists also say similarly, as long as an observer is there, there is an observed object. Now, with regard to the observer, such as the subjective mind, you need to explain it. In India, in Indian traditions, of course, there is explanation of the observer as well. Whereas in quantum physics, the explanation of what the observer is there's no explanation yet. With regard to the subjective mind, we need to talk about mind in terms of its moment by moment change. So we have the present moments, the past and the future moments. But if you really were to look at the present moment of a mind, of course, with regard to the three moments, the past is already gone, future is yet to come. But the present, with regard to the present, we can say the present millennium, present century, present decade, present year, month, the day, hour, minute, and down to the present second. So if you were to point at the present second, half of it is already gone, half is yet to come. So where is the present? Even with regards to just as with regard to the external objects, the internal object of internal subjective mind also cannot be found when you do this kind of analysis. So of course we have the sense of an I am this. And therefore, some philosophical schools say that this I, the sense of I that we have, has its object, which is the I, which is actually as an aspect of a mind. And so, with regard to the I, you cannot talk about the I on the basis of the body. You cannot say the body is the I, nor these feelings and other aggregates, but the consciousness, the mental consciousness. So therefore, within the Buddhist philosophical schools, there are those who say the mind, that mental consciousness is an identity of the self. So even within those of the Madhyamakas, there are those who say the sixth mental consciousness is the identity of the person. Whereas if you really, even that, if you put that to test and scrutinize it, you will not be able to actually have anything that you can pinpoint as being the self. And so the meditation on the mindfulness of mind leads to that of the true cessation, and meditation on the mindfulness of phenomena, mental objects, leads to the true path. And then of the 37 aids to enlightenment, there are those of the four exertions, and then the 5 powers and 5 faculties, and which includes faith, joyous effort, single-pointed concentration, and meditative concentration, wisdom, and so forth. And so, the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths are the philosophical ideas of Buddhism, and on the basis of which we develop the path, which are mentioned, which are given in the 37 practices. And so, that of the dependent nature of things is the essential teaching of the Buddha. And so with regard to dependent origination, there is the causality, and therefore the Buddha said there is no self which is independent. He said the notion of I that we have is a devilish mind. Because all the psychophysical aggregates are empty, therefore there's no self. And by saying that, he doesn't mean the self as in the sense of a nihilism, but the self is said to be designated on the basis of the 5 psychophysical aggregates, just as a chariot is designated on its parts. So as long as you assert a self within the mind, it could only be asserted as the 6th mind, the mental consciousness. So when we talk about causality, of course, the happiness is what we really desire, and suffering we don't desire. And therefore, the teaching on the Four Noble Truths teach the causality of those which we want, do not want, suffering in its origin, and suffering as the result, and its origin as the cause. And then, so we have a set of causality there, and then pertaining to samsara, and then a set of causality pertaining to enlightenment, which are the true cessation, which is led to by the true path. So that's how we go about with the practice of Buddhism on the basis of law of causality. And of course, the theistic religions are very good, although, of course, they practice on the basis of faith alone. So pain and pleasure are caused from the point of view of causality. What we say is pain and pleasure are our own doing. And therefore, you think about the self or a person on the basis of the mind. Of course, we have the aggregates such as form, feelings, and then those of the discrimination or perception of mental formation, and then consciousness. And therefore, within the non-theistic religious traditions of India, there is so much explanation of the mind. So in Buddhism, it's said that happiness is there when your mind is tamed, and when the mind is unruly, there is suffering. So those factors which cause the mind to be indisciplined are within the mind itself, and then also those causes which bring about happiness are within the mind itself. And therefore, those factors which cause us to lose our equilibrium of mind, peace of mind, are called destructive emotions. So even in the non-Buddhist traditions, there is the practice of developing meditative absorptions by seeing the desire ram as being gross, and compared to which those of the higher rams of existence, such as form ram and so forth, are more subtle and peaceful. And so accordingly, there are practices leading to the development of concentration, leading to those of the form rams and formless rams. And then in Buddhism, there is teaching of antidotes to these destructive emotions, which leads to that of the purification of the overcoming of these negative emotions. So we cannot overcome the negative emotions, destructive emotions, by reciting mantras or doing prayers, but we need to know how these arise in us. And so mainly we are usually tossed by attachment and anger or hatred, and these two are rooted in ignorance, which here is the ignorance which causes us to have attachment and anger. As in Brahmanavartika it says, as said in Brahmanavartika, when you have a strong sense of me or I, then that leads you to make division between you and me. And then accordingly, you also create those of the negative. You have the attachment and anger. And of course, as the philosophical views are deepened, then there is also difference in identifying that of the ignorance. And so the subtlest view comes from those Madhyamakas who do not assert any kind of fixation in things, self-characterized, self-defined characteristics of phenomena. So from this point of view, the teachings of the Buddha could be seen without any contradiction. Because if you were to hold on to some view which actually asserts some kind of objective existence and things, you cannot actually overcome the negative emotions. And therefore, the Buddha's teaching is also said to be the one which fulfills the interests of the two interests, the dual interest of sentient beings. Because Master Nagarjuna says that things have no objective independent existence because they are dependently arisen. And so this is the final reason to say that things are empty of any objective existence. And so the reasoning of dependent arising or dependent origination is said to be the king of reasoning, because as Master Nagarjuna says, because things are dependent, they are arisen, therefore they have no objective independent existence. Things can only exist in two ways. Either they can exist independently without depending on any other factors, or they can exist dependently. If things were to have any independent existence, it should be clearer and clearer as you delve into the nature of them, whereas that doesn't happen. It's like saying, as Master Nagarjuna says, if the mirage were to be a water, then the closer you get to it, you should have still that water there, but it disappears as you get closer to it. And therefore, things are without any objective independent existence. That doesn't mean things do not exist, but things are dependently arisen. And therefore, regarding dependent nature of things, the coarsest form of that understanding of dependence is that of causality, which explains that effects arise through dependence on their causes. And through that understanding, we actually gain insight into how to live a life that can, a virtuous life, which can lead us to higher rebirths. Whereas by understanding the deeper nature, which is to say that non-independent existence of things, we gain this insight and lead us to that of the nirvana. And so this is what is meant by the dual interests or the goals of sentient beings, that of the higher rebirth and that of the nirvana. And so all teachings of the Four Noble Truths, which teach those of the Four Noble Truths and the 16 aspects, as well as those of the 37 practices, are shared with other Buddhist traditions. Whereas, which is to say that the Pali tradition followers also have that teaching, whereas the Sanskrit tradition, according to the Sanskrit tradition, the Buddha taught the Panchaparamita Sutras, the Perfect and Wisdom Sutras, in Sanskrit, which to a few select disciples, which are not there in the Pali tradition. So, this Perfect and Wisdom Sutras actually explain in greater detail what is taught in the First Noble Truth, and particularly that of the true cessation. And so in the Heart Sutra, we find mention of even the five aggregates have no intrinsic existence. So the word even is there in Tibetan, but not in Chinese translation, and neither in Japanese. And so checked whether this word exists in the Sanskrit, and so and I found out that it did exist. It does exist in the Sanskrit version. So this word, even or also, is very significant, because in the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, the Buddha mainly taught selflessness of persons and not selflessness of phenomena as such. So the psychophysical aggregates, such as the form and so forth, were, it was given an impression that they do have some intrinsic existence. So this selflessness of phenomena, referring to the psychophysical aggregates, is not taught in the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. Although there is teaching within the Four Noble Truths where it says that the suffering must be overcome, but there's nothing to be overcome, and so forth. So the word also, or even in this phrase, even the five aggregates are empty of intrinsic existence, says that not only there is the selflessness of persons, but there is also the selflessness of phenomena. The selflessness of person, which was taught before in the Four Noble Truths. And so the second, the connotation of this word, even or also, is that not only the self or the person is without any inherent existence, but also the five psychophysical aggregates have no inherent existence. And Master Nagarjuna says, as long as in Ratnavali, as long as there is grasping at the psychophysical aggregates, to that extent there will be grasping at a self. Because if you look at our own experience, when we think of ourselves, I am this, I am that, on the basis of our mind or the body,
풍부 아니 가서다 풍부다 감다 기시사 기대마 즉 소년들 더마 수기 풍부.
And so, with regard to the psychophysical aggregates, there is the form, sensations, and so forth. And so, to explain the emptiness or selflessness of these psychophysical aggregates, the Buddha first touches that of form, saying form is empty, emptiness is form, emptiness is not other than form, and form too is not other than emptiness. And therefore, the form, when you actually look or search for the designated object, the form itself, you will not be able to find anything within the object as being the form as such. And so that doesn't mean that, when we say things are form is empty, it means that form is without any inherent existence. Because it is empty of any inherent existence, therefore it is dependent. And therefore it comes about. A form arises through dependence on many causes and conditions. And therefore, based on the reason that things are dependent, it is said that things are empty. And because things are empty, it is said that we could actually say they are dependent also. And therefore, this reasoning of dependent origination can do away with the two extremes of nihilism and that of the eternalism. Because form comes about through its causes and conditions, it has no inherent existence, and therefore we can prove that its dependence on causes and conditions can give rise to the insight into its emptiness. And then with regard to the emptiness of the form and form itself, they are of the same called entity or nature, but distinct conceptually. And therefore, the second turning of the wheel of Dharma explains in great detail that of the true cessation. And then in the third turning of the wheel of Dharma, what was taught in the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, that is to say that from form up to omniscience, nothing exists inherently. And therefore, for those who were not able to take that literally, the third turning of the wheel of Dharma, which is the one aspect of it is that of the teaching on the sutra of Santi Nimochana Sutra unraveling the thought. And so the Buddha in that sutra says that by having in mind the three features of the three natures in mind, he says there is no, he taught that in the second turning that there is no inherent existence in things. And so following Master Nagarjuna's teaching, we have the 400 verses of Aryadeva, and then also Madhyamaka Hridaya and its commentary by Bhaviveka, and also Chandrakirti's commentaries or texts such as Madhyamaka Avatara and its commentary, and also which is which comments on the content or the meaning of the Madhyamaka Karika by Nagarjuna, and then we have the lucid words of Chandrakirti as well, which explains the Madhyamaka Karika word by word. And so in these teachings of particularly the Chandrakirti, it is mentioned that there are certain teachings of the Buddha which can be taken literally, and there are those which cannot be taken literally. And those that are to be not taken to be literal are those which need to be interpreted. And therefore, making such a distinction between the provisional and the definitive teachings within the teaching of the Buddha exists only in the Nalanda tradition. And this is actually following the Buddha's statement where he says, "O monks and scholars, just as the gold is tested by burning, cutting and rubbing, likewise you should examine my teaching and then accept it, not because you have devotion or faith in me." And so there are, of course, difference in the interpretation of what constitutes provisional teachings and what constitutes in definitive teachings, according to the Chittamatras and the Madhyamakas. In any case, there are this kind of distinction between the definitive and the provisional teachings. And then within the third turning of the wheel of Dharma, there is also the Tathagata Garbha Sutra, which becomes the source of Mahayana Uttara Tantra by Maitreya. And so there is also another sutra which is called the exalted wisdom at the time of around the time of passing away. And so these constitute the third turning of the wheel of Dharma, which emphasizes the teaching of the path. So these So within the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, we can also include those of the Vinaya teachings. The Vinaya was laid down as some problems arose, and there's some questions or some qualms arose, and then the Vinaya rules were laid down. And so we have the three turnings of the wheel of Dharma, and then we have around the time of the 13th Dalai Lama, there was a Tibetan master named Nyengun Sungrapa. He makes a distinction between the teaching of the Buddha, categorizes them into two. One is the general structure of the teaching, and one is the specifically tailored teachings. And so the Tantra comes within the second category, and then the Sutrayana comes within the first category, the general approach. So in some countries like Japan, there are people like who practice Tantra, and they focus only on Tantric practices, and they do not actually pay much interest in the Sutrayana teachings, although they do recite the Heart Sutra, but they don't seem to have any study of the teaching. And in Tibet also, people have focused on tantric teachings, tantric rituals, and didn't have much study of the general structure of the teaching. So this is a drawback in the Tibetan community in the past. And so without the foundation of the general structure teachings, of course, there's no way you can practice Tantra effectively. So therefore, we need to study the Sutrayana teachings, and then having a good foundation in these, then if you go into the Tantric teachings, it will be effective. So, of course, the specifically tailored teachings were given to very specific disciples according to their dispositions, their inclination, and so these tantric teachings were given according to the physiological structure specific to the person, individual, and their specific interests and dispositions. And so accordingly, we have many different tantric teachings. And even the Buddha himself arose in the form of the deities and not staying as a bhikshu, except in some Kriya Tantra teachings where the Buddha appears in the form of a monk. All the rest of the tantric teachings were given with him arising in the form of a deity. So the teaching that we are going to go through, which is the middle stages of the path and Je Rinpoche's Song of Experience, these pertain to the general structure of the teaching of the Buddha, whereas the day after tomorrow, what we are going to go through is the Dzogchen teaching. And Dzogchen teaching actually is based on the luminous state of mind, the innate clear light or luminous mind. And Mahamudra also is explained on that basis. And in the Dzogchen tradition, there is the distinction between Sem, the ordinary afflicted mind, and that of the Rigpa, pristine awareness. And so the Rigpa is the Sem or mind is taken to be that which is affected by grasping, and Rigpa is the state of mind which is unaffected by it. Whereas in the other tradition of highest yoga tantra, there is emphasis on using the subtle energy, the bindus, and then those of the channels and veins are used in one's practice, whereas in the Dzogchen tradition, whatever state of mind we are in, there is still that the aspect of luminosity or the clarity and awareness in it. And so that is what is emphasized in Dzogchen practice, without having to go through the practice based on those of the bindus, the subtle the wind energy and so forth. So with regard to the teaching, the text that we are going to go through first, the second volume of the Stages of Meditation, it was written by Master Shantarakshita, who was invited to Tibet by the Tibetan Emperor Trisong Detsen at that time, and who under whose direction the translations of the sutras and tantras were carried out in Samye, in the department of the translation department. And then there is also he found within the Samye monastery, there was the department of Vinaya, the pure morality department for the monastics. And so Shantarakshita was the one who actually gave the ordination, the monastic ordination to Tibetans. And then there was the meditation department within Samye, where Chinese practitioners lived also. And then with regard to tantric practitioners, because Master Padmasambhava himself was responsible for giving the tantric teachings, there was this department of the tantric practices. And so, under the direction and guidance and instruction of the Master Shantarakshita, As there was also the kind of a prophecy that there will be some problem in the future at that time. Master Chandrakshita had actually said that you should invite my student, Kamalashilas, and so in the Samye monastery itself, there were Chinese practitioners who had said that there was no need for study of the teaching. Mere meditative practice, meditation, can lead us to that of the enlightenment. And so, in order to challenge that, I have also seen in Japan there were people who say that mere meditation alone is sufficient for enlightenment, and so Kamalashilas was invited to Tibet to challenge that, and so he was invited by Tsong Detsen, and the Tsong Detsen himself requested Kamalashilas to write this text. So the historians today say that Tibet was a very powerful nation in the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. One of the in America, Columbia University scholars have done some research, and they have actually written a book saying that in the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, there were 3 empires, which were Tibet, Mongolia, and China. But after the 9th century, 8th and 9th century, the Tibetan empire also declined, and therefore the power declined, but nevertheless we have the Tibetan script, the writing, which was either newly devised during the time of Tsongkhapas, or it was developed further from what existed. So whatever the case may be, we have Tibetan script. And therefore, Chandrakshita advised the Tibetans to translate the teachings, Buddhist literature, into Tibetan itself. And therefore, we have the over 300 volumes which comprise over 100 volumes of the Kangyur, which is the translation of the words of the Buddha, and then over 200 volumes of the Tengyur, the translations of exegetical texts. And so under the direction of the at the invitation of at the invitation of the Tibetan Emperor Tsong Detsen, Chandrakshita came to Tibet, and therefore the translations of this Buddhist literature was undertaken under his auspices, and therefore today, to explain the Buddhist philosophical ideas, we have Tibetan, which is very precise in explaining the Sanskrit terms, because Tibetan was actually Tibetan language itself kind of improved or developed as the translations were carried out, and therefore we can explain the Buddhist concepts precisely as it is in the case of Sanskrit. And so, having met with many different scholars from different fields, I have found the Buddhist traditions, I found this to be true. So in this language of India, it is called Bhavanakrama, and in the Tibetan language, Gombe Rimba, which is to say the stages of meditation, homage to the youthful Manjushri. So the stages of meditation, the title itself refers to meditation. In the past, some of the practitioners in the Samye monastery said that we need to only we could only do meditation and no need of study. And so he said the title is given as Stages of Meditation. I shall briefly explain the stages of meditation for those who follow the system of Mahayana Sutras. The intelligent who wish to actualize omniscience extremely quickly should make the deliberate effort to fulfill its causes and conditions. So Buddhism teaches that of law of causality. Pain and pleasure are our experience of body and mind. So pain comes about through causes and conditions. Happiness also comes about through causes and conditions. So this is what is said. So those who wishes to actualize omniscience very simply quickly should make the Tsongkhapas the Denpa in Tibetan, which is translated as the intelligent one here, refers to Tsongkhapas the Denpa refers to those with critical faculty, those who wish to check things critically, not following on faith, taking things on faith. So I usually say that if we follow the teaching of the Buddha according to those with duller faculty, those who base more on faith, then Buddhism may not survive for much long. But if we could follow the teaching of the Buddha according to those who use critical scrutiny, those of sharp intelligence, sharp faculty, then Buddhism could actually survive for several centuries more. And so the Buddha himself has said we should examine his teaching. Therefore, if the Lamas were of that kind of caliber, using intelligence, using reasoning and logic rather than mere faith, then it could also help their disciples to be more critical as well. So whether omniscience is possible or not, it depends on whether we understand whether that of true cessation is possible or not. So within the understanding of true cessation, we need to also, we would also come across the understanding and insight into what ignorance is about, means, what ignorance means. And therefore, with regard to the Four Noble Truths, if we are able to see that this ignorance is something that we can overcome, then we can see that negative emotions can be overcome. Of course, there is the difference in interpretation of what the obscuration of knowledge and what is obscuration to that of the obscuration of the afflictive emotions mean according to the different philosophical traditions, philosophical schools. So overcoming negative emotions, the disturbing emotions completely from one's own mind, you attain that of nirvana or liberation. And by overcoming even the stains left by those negative emotions, which are known as obscuration to knowledge, then you attain that of omniscient state of Buddhahood. And so that of the understanding of emptiness, the view of emptiness is antidote to our ignorance, which grasps at some kind of independent existence in things. And therefore, you can see how through this realization of emptiness one can overcome the negative emotions. And therefore, to understand Buddhism well, you will need to actually build up our understanding from the teaching of, on the basis of teaching of the Four Noble Truths. So with regard to attaining higher and attain a higher rebirth, as Master Aryadeva says, first overcome those of the non-meritorious practices. So all religious traditions, including the theistic ones, also have the teaching leading to higher rebirths. But with regard to that of the definitive goodness, Master Chandrakirti says that the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha are the refuges to those who aspire to liberation. So the definite goodness is teaching which actually is found in the teaching of the Buddha, which teaches that of the selflessness. So on the basis of understanding of selflessness, that of the definite goodness is taught. So one should make a deliberate effort to fulfill its causes and conditions. So main cause of the Buddhahood are twofold, that of bodhicitta and the understanding of emptiness. So the understanding of emptiness, the wisdom realizing emptiness, is necessary in order to develop this compassion, whereby you not just wish others to be out of suffering, but you want actually to take the task on your shoulder. While suffering is something that can be overcome, yet people are overcome with suffering because of their ignorance, and so you feel compassion for them. It is not possible for omniscience to be produced without causes, because if it were, everything could always be omniscient. If things were produced without reliance on something else, they could exist without constraint. There would be no reason why everything could not be omniscient. Therefore, since all functional things arise occasionally, they depend strictly on their causes. Omniscience too is rare because it does not occur at all times and in all places, and everything cannot become omniscient. So with regard to the objects of knowledge, it is threefold: the manifest objects, the evident ones, and then those of the slightly hidden, and then extremely hidden. So this distinction or the categorization of the three objects into three is done by doing analysis into things. So what the scientists are investigating into is mostly those which are evident objects. And then through that, one can actually come to some kind of understanding of what constitutes slightly hidden phenomena, and then so when we use inferential logic, which gives rise to inferential cognition, we need to actually use reason. And so on the basis of reason, we can come to some conclusion, but then that also needs to be corroborated by our experience, empirical experience of things. So recently I had a meeting, the first ever meeting with Russian scientists in Delhi.
Oh yeah.
So for over 30 years, oh, this is disturbing. This voice coming. So for over 30 years I have had the voice from the hall is coming in here. It's not good. Disturbing.
I don't manage the microphones.
So having had this discussion with scientists for over 30 years, I found that there's mutual benefit to the scientists as well as us as Buddhists. And then I've urged our monastic institutions to start learning science as well. And so in the monastic institutions, such as Sera, Drepung, Ganden, and so forth, there are sections which have been opened for study of science. And then we also had several Buddhist monks from our monastic institutions go to Emory University in America to study science. And then last year, in order to expand on the scope of knowledge, I find that it's very good to be educated in both the fields, modern science as well as our traditional subjects. So with regard to compounded phenomena, with regard to the objects of knowledge, there are two categories that we can divide things into, phenomena into. One is those of the compounded phenomena and uncompounded phenomena. Within the first category, there is the which actually constitutes moment-by-moment change in things, and this includes those that are matter, and then those that are consciousness, and then those which are some kind of abstract phenomena called, such as impermanence itself. And so it's said that the omniscience is a compounded phenomena because it comes through causes and conditions. I will not go through I will not read the text, the whole text. So with regard to the four aspects of the origin of suffering, in Compendium of Knowledge by Asanga, there are mention of the three conditions, which are unwavered condition, which means that things do not come about through some creator God as such. And then the second condition is the impermanent condition, which means that things can only come about through causes and conditions and not without causes and conditions. And then within the causality, or causes and conditions, there are those we need the compatible causes and conditions which can give rise to something. For example, if we have a flower like this, even within the seed of these flowers, just as the Sankhya school says, which say that all the results that we see, the manifest flower, is there within the seed itself. Of course, we don't say such things, but there is a potential condition, as Master Asanga mentions, so which refers to the compatible conditions which can give rise to its effect. So the text says that the omniscience or the Buddhahood has its roots in compassion, as Master Nagarjuna says. If you wish to attain Buddhahood for oneself and others, what you need to develop are the threefold causes, which are that of compassion, bodhicitta, and the wisdom of non-dual wisdom. So from among these causes, you should cultivate the correct and complete causes. If you put the wrong causes into practice and so forth, and so the text mentions that these are the three. You need to practice these three: compassion, the awakening mind, and of bodhicitta, and the skillful means.
다음에 되게 이 순구와 가소리 되는 순구 지인 주단이 이제 두선 특인 무슨에
So as I had explained in the introductory talk,
되는 순구
the stages of meditation goes through the teachings contained in the three Pitaka.
아니 별이야 해지 들어 그래서 주지 중이
So with regard to the Lamrim,
조지 다 별이야
when in the 10th, 11th century, Master Adisha came to Tibet, George Adisha, the Lamrim teachings started around that time as a genre of teaching. So before his coming to Tibet, the Tibet had declined so much in its power that Tibet has become a fragmented state. And around that time, when Adisha came to Tibet, masters, Tibetan descendants of the Tibetan emperors, such as Yishiwu, was actually killed by some king, and then his younger brother, Changjubu, invited the Master Adisha to Tibet, of course at the behest of Yeshiwu himself. And with regard to the spread of Buddhism in India, it seems there were institutions like Takshashila, Nalanda, and then after Takshashila came that of Nalanda institution. It seems that at the time of the Buddha, there was a small institution, but later it developed and was expanded. And then after that came that of Kamalashilas, and which further developed later. And around that time, when he was invited to Tibet, he was living in Kamalashilas. So of course, the study he did was the text of the Nalanda masters. And so by sending Nakcho Lotsa, or the translator Nakcho and so forth, Changjubu invited Adisha, and in Töling, in the western part of Tibet, Changjubu requested a teaching which would be beneficial for a whole of Tibet. And so the genre called Lamrim originated or started since then. So Master Dromtuemba, the amazing, the wondrous teachings of the Buddha, words of the Buddha, are the three baskets. And then with regard to the purpose of the teachings contained in that, there are those teachings which pertain to leading us to that of the higher rebirth and those of that of the definite goodness. And so Master Aryadeva actually goes through first overcoming the non-meritorious actions, and then in the middle overcoming the notion of a self, and then finally overcoming all views, distorted views. And so this is the kind of source for Adisha's teaching on the stages of the path to enlightenment. So the teachings pertaining to the beings of small scope are those that lead to higher rebirth, and then the teachings for those of the intermediate scope or faculty are those leading to that of the definite goodness, that of nirvana, and then we have teachings pertaining to the beings of greater scope. His Holiness was earlier thinking of not going through the stages of meditation, but now has changed his mind. He thinks he can finish, even if he goes, he reads the whole text as in the form of giving a lung as well, the oral reading transmission. Therefore, it definitely. So therefore, it's definitely, since all functional things and so forth, and omniscience too is rare because it does not occur at all times in all places, and everything cannot become omniscient. Therefore, it definitely depends on causes and conditions. And then training the mind. Also, among these causes and conditions, you should cultivate the correct and complete causes. If you put the wrong causes into practice, even if you work hard for a long time, the desired goal cannot be achieved. Will be like milking a cow's horn. Likewise, the result will not be produced when all the causes are not put into practice. Effect. For example, if the seed or any other cause is missing, then the result, the sprout, and so forth, will not be produced. Therefore, those who desire a particular result should cultivate its complete and unmistaken causes and conditions. If you ask what are the causes and conditions of the final fruits of omniscience, I who am like a blind may not be in a position to explain myself, but I shall employ the Buddha's own words. And so here, when the reference is to use, by saying using the Buddha's own words, it actually refers to using those the authority of Buddha's words is to come to the conclusion of the extremely hidden phenomena. And of course, I do not believe in the existence of Mount Meru. So Master Nagarjuna and the past masters have mentioned the existence of Mount Meru and so forth, following what was prevalently believed in those days. And Master Vasubandhu's text, Abhidhammakosha Karika, says everything arises from karma. All the varieties of world, the multitude of worlds arise through karma, which is very similar to a non-Buddhist Hindu text which talks about cosmology, where it mentioned that everything comes through Brahma. So I usually say that the Buddha did not appear or come to the world to measure the earth or anything like that, but he came to teach the Four Noble Truths and so forth. And then in other scriptures, we find mention of different forms of world systems. And so there could be many different forms of the world, planets and so forth. As Master Vasubandhu says, that from karma arises varieties of worlds. So sometimes when I say that I don't believe in the Mount Meru, people become uncomfortable. That should not be the case, because in our own text, in our own text, it is mentioned that there are those which are things. If they do exist, they should be perceptible to us. Since they are not perceptible, they cannot exist. So such a reasoning of non-observance of things is used. And so this applies to that of the Mount Meru. Then we can if it existed, of course, it should be perceptible. Because it's not perceptible, we can say it does not exist. And so the reasoning applies here. So here it is not, Master Kamalashilas does not mean that everything the Buddha has said should be resort. To see the truth of it, we should resort to his words. That's not the case, because there are teachings which can be verified through inferential logic. May not be in a position to explain by myself, but I shall employ the Buddha's own words, just as he spoke them to his disciples. So he said, Vajrapani, Lord of Sacred, the transcendent wisdom of omniscience, has its roots in compassion and arises from the cause, altruistic thought, awakening mind of bodhicitta, and the perfection of skillful means. Therefore, if you are interested in achieving omniscience, you need to practice these three: compassion, awakening mind, bodhicitta, and skillful means. Moved by compassion, bodhisattvas take the vow of liberating all sentient beings. Then, by overcoming their self-centered outlook, they engage eagerly and continuously in the very difficult practice of accumulating merit and insight. Having entered into this practice, they will certainly complete the collection of merit and insights. So just like the Shravakas, the Bodhisattvas do not reside in the one-sided peace of liberation. So developing equanimity So with regards to developing equanimity, perhaps we could switch to the Lamrim text. So Master Adisha wrote his lamp for the path to enlightenment, on the basis of which Longchen Ramjapa wrote the trilogy of ease and comfort, and of three of these of the trilogy, that of the Semging also teaches the path according to Adisha's Lamrim structure. And then Gampopa also wrote his jewel ornament of liberation, following the same pattern as laid down in that of the Adisha's lamp. And similarly, it is the case with the Sakya tradition of and then with regard to Master Tsongkhapa, he wrote the great treatise on the path to enlightenment, and then the middle stages of the path to enlightenment, and then this short text on the Lamrim, which is called the Song of Experience. Condensed points of the stages of the path, written by Master Tsongkhapa as a song of spiritual experience. So Lamrim Nyamgur, your body is created from 1 billion perfect factors of goodness. Your speech satisfies the yearning of countless sentient beings. Your mind perceives all objects of knowledge exactly as they are. I bow my head to you, O chief of Shakya clan. So this is a praise or salutation to the Buddha. And so he praises the Buddha from the point of view of having an excellent, perfect body. The first line refers to the body, perfect body. And then the second line refers to the excellent speech. So the body is praised from the point of view of its causes giving rise to such an effect. And then the over countless eons accumulated over these three countless eons and so forth. And then the speech is praised. And so, of course, constructing Buddha statues is very good. I was once asked to be to attend an inauguration ceremony of Buddha Vihara, and I have said that Buddha statues, of course, may remain for centuries, but what we need is, and also there are Buddha statues in Bodh Gaya as well, and so what we need is the teaching of the Buddha. And so the speech of the Buddha is one which can actually satisfy the varieties of dispositions of sentient beings. So it has such a power to do that. And then the mind is praised as that which sees everything precisely as it is. In the salutation verse of the Abhisamaya Alamkara, it says, the fact that the Buddha is able to satisfy the wishes and desires of sentient beings is because of his omniscience. And so the mind of the Buddha is praised for having its perfect nature, from the point of view of its nature, excellent nature. And speech is praised from the point of view of excellent fruit of it. So with regard to the perfection of wisdom teachings, sutras, it has those of the explicit content and the implicit content. So regarding the second one, the master, the regent of the Buddha, Maitreya, wrote Abhisamaya Alamkara and so forth, commented on the explicit meaning or the content, and then those of the Master Nagarjuna wrote explained the explicit content. So in the commentary to Sandhi Nimochana Sutra by Wenchek, which mentions, which I found out later that he was a Korean scholar, an abbot, and I read his commentary on the Sandhi Nimochana Sutra, where he mentions that Maitreya is the name that was given after his mother, whose name was Maitri. And so it mentions that he had his own parents. And so with regard to the Maitreya, of course, if he were a god of the Tushita heaven, of course, there's no need for parents. But it seems there was also a Maitreya who was a human being, as believed or by the Chinese tradition. So the second verse and then the third verse, referring to Nagarjuna and Asanga. So with regard to the perfection of wisdom teachings, if we go through the 100,000 verses of Panchaparamita or the 8,000 verses and so forth, it's difficult for us to, without relying on some commentary. So we have Master Nagarjuna's writings, mainly that of Mula Madhyamaka Karika, the wisdom verses of the middle way, the fundamental wisdom verses of the middle way, and then commenting on the explicit content of the perfection of wisdom, and then Maitreya's Abhisamaya Alankara, and which explicates those of the implicit content of the perfection of wisdom, which goes through the what are known as the knowledge of the basis, knowledge of the path, omniscience, and then those of the applications within the path, applying the path within ourselves. So verse number 4, verse number 3, 2 and 3 refers to those of the profound view lineage and the extensive path lineage, contact lineage, and then all these teachings came down or flowed into one person, that is Dipamkara, Matsadisha. And so verse number 4 is a salutation to him. And then you are the eye to see all the myriad collections of scriptures. So the teachings of the three Pitaka were collected into the teachings pertaining to the three types of beings of three capacities, and therefore we have the Kadam tradition. So Domtempa mentions that whoever recites this or sends the beads of this rosary of Kadam, it will be meaningful to them. And so within the Kadam tradition, there are those of the Kadam, the scholastic tradition, the Lamrim tradition, and then the instruction lineage of Kadam. So, of course, without study of the scholarly teachings, the classic writings, I mean, you cannot have someone called Lamrimpa or anything like that. So one time in Kham, a region of Tibet, there was a monastery where some visitors came, and then when one monk who was there in the monastery was asked where the abbot went, the monk who had quite a big mouth perhaps had said the abbot had gone to the town, to the village, to scare the people in the village. So unless you have a good understanding of the whole of the teaching of the Buddha, particularly here that of the true cessation, what it means, as Rinpoche mentions in the Lamrim teaching, where he says, therefore, the Four Noble Truths are the basis of the basic teachings in all the teachings of the Buddha, and the teachings of Mahayana, Hinayana, and so forth. And so this is how you also should lead your disciples, your students, on the basis of the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. So otherwise, the teachings of the Buddha would also be like other traditions, where the other traditions, such as the theistic religions, say that if you don't believe in God, you'll go to hell. It would be similar to that. And then we also come across mention of all the different kinds of the hell realms, the 18 different layers of hell and so forth. If you don't practice well, you'll go to hell and so forth. And so these teachings would be like scaring people without giving them good understanding of the teaching as a whole. So verse number 6, you are the crowning jewel among all learned ones of this world. Your banner of fame flutter vibrantly among the sentient beings. O Nagarjuna and Sangha, from you follow in an excellent steady stream this instruction on the stages of the path to enlightenment. Since it fulfills all the wishes of beings without exception, it is the king of kings. Among all quintessential instructions, since it gathers into its thousands of excellent rivers of treatises, it's as well the ocean of most glorious, well-uttered insights. It helps to recognize all teachings to be free of contradictions. It helps the downing of the scriptures as pith instructions. It helps to find easily the enlightened intention of conqueror. It helps also to guard against the abyss of grave negative deeds. Therefore, this most excellent instruction that is sought after by numerous fortunate ones, like the learned ones in India and Tibet. This instruction of in the stages of the path to a person of three capacities. The concise instruction distilling the essence of all scriptures, even though reciting it or listening to it only once, the benefits of teaching the Dharma, listening to it, and so on, since such waves of merit are bound to be gathered, contemplates its meaning. And so, in order to understand the teaching, we need to first to engage in the study, listening to the teaching. So whatever you have heard, you need to gain conviction in them through reflection, and then use that in meditation to develop experience of the teaching. So therefore, these three processes are we can understand them as in terms of causality. So without listening to the teachings, without learning the teaching, we cannot develop conviction, without which we cannot have the experience through meditation. So what meditation means is to familiarize our mind with the teachings, the meaning. And then in order to be able to do that, you need to have conviction, deep conviction in the teachings, which comes through our reflection. Without gaining conviction, there's no way you can do practice, meditation. And so in order to develop the understanding based on reflection, we need to first hear the teaching, without which you cannot do reflection on them. And so with regard to listening to the teaching, for example, we have Madhyamaka Hridaya, or the essence of the middle way, by Bhaviveka, and its commentary, which is the blades of reasoning. And in there you find all the different philosophical schools and traditions that developed in India up to that time are found mentioned, and therefore to study them, to study the philosophical ideas are very important. In our text, we come across the 3 points: rejecting or criticizing others' points of view, positions, and establishing one's own position, and then rebuttal of the criticism to that. So we need to see the reason in the teachings. And in order to be able to do that, we need to critically scrutinize the teachings and then see, what are contradictions in the other teachings, other traditions, and so, having learned the teaching, you do reflection, and through your reflection, which is to go over the teachings over and over again, so that through critical inquiry, you come across some decision in the end, and then gain conviction in it. And therefore, through that conviction, you develop insight into the teaching of emptiness, for example, and thereby gaining the understanding that that true cessation and nirvana are possible, and by overcoming our own negative emotions, particularly ignorance. And therefore, in order to listen to the teachings, in order to be able to engage in this three-tiered process, we need a teacher. So not only reading the text, but if you could actually receive the teaching from a teacher, a guru, it really inspires you also. So such a Lama has to have these 10 qualifications as mentioned in the Sutra Alamkara, such as being peaceful, subdued, and thoroughly pacified, and so forth. And so it's not only enough just to have somebody who can give some teaching to you. So these verse comes from Sutra Alamkara, and it is quoted in the great treatise of the stages of the path by Master Tsongkhapa. Before this quote, he actually comes with this comment: if you are not subdued yourself, there's no way you can subdue and help discipline others. And therefore, those who wish to subdue others, tame others, must first tame themselves. So one doctor, a Tibetan doctor, said, and a patient came to him or her, and the doctor said, "Oh, you have to be careful. You are a patient. You have to be careful." And this patient was quite impatient, and he retorted back to the doctor, "You have to be careful." So here, with regard to the teaching of the Dharma, we are not telling stories. We are not going through some history or anything like that. But we are talking about disciplining one's own mind, taming one's own mind. Therefore, someone who claims to be a Dharma teacher must become tamed themselves. And therefore, Master Tsongkhapa mentioned that. And with regard to taming the mind, you cannot just have anything that comes across, that you come across as a practice, but you actually should follow the pattern that is found in the general teaching of the Buddha itself. And so what that means is one should be actually tamed through the three trainings: the training of morality, training of concentration, and through training of wisdom. So Master Tsongkhapa's writings are quite comprehensive. So he says you cannot just have any kind of practice and any kind of experience, but you should actually go through the training based on the three trainings and the general teaching of the Buddha. And then he says that the teacher must be someone who has greater knowledge than the disciple, because then he can help the disciple, he or she can help the disciple. And then the teacher must also be someone who is who perseveres in the practice. And Sutra Alamkara is a text that belongs to the Chittamatra school of philosophy. And then the teacher must also have insight into the reality of the final reality of things, and then must be skillful in teaching, and must not feel fatigued or tired when he gives teachings to others. in Kham region of Tibet, whether a Lama is great or not is measured by the number of horses and animals in the caravan. So if there are many, then the Lama is considered great. But Zapetu Rinpoche didn't have such things, such possessions. And so when many disciples gathered around him in one place, he became a little bit uncomfortable, and then he left the place. And so he came to another place where he sought, where the host took him in and gave him the place to stay. And then the host family actually used him as their servant. And then, he was actually sweeping the floor, and then and his disciples followed him in search of him, and he came to this house. And the disciples asked, "Did you see one Lama?" And the family said, "No, we just have found one traveler." And where did that traveler go? And the mother of the house said, he went to throw away to clear my the pot. And then the disciples actually asked, what did the person look like? And the family described him. He had this kind of face, and so and so. And then the disciples came to know that was their Lama, and they said that was our Lama. And then the mother of the house actually felt very embarrassed and ran away. And so Lamas having possessions and measuring the greatness of the Lama on the basis of these kind of possessions has some influence of the feudal system. And so the first Dalai Lama and second Dalai Lama didn't have any such name as the Dalai Lama, but the third Dalai Lama, because he went to Mongolia, he got the title, and then the fourth Dalai Lama also came, and then the fifth Dalai Lama became the Dalai Lama, who the first one who took the dual responsibility of Tibet. And so I think that the Lamas becoming some kind of a head of administration or government and so forth is because of some kind of a feudal influence. So in 2001, I became semi-retired because we got the elected political leader, and then in 2011, I totally gave up the political authority, and as we had that of the politically elected Sikyong. And so since 2011, I left the political responsibility, and therefore I have no political responsibility. And so I ended this tradition of the Dalai Lamas becoming, since the fifth Dalai Lama's time, taking the dual responsibility. I voluntarily, happily, and proudly gave up that political authority. And so I don't find it good to have a Lama who becomes both a political and spiritual leader. And so a Lama must be someone who has all these qualifications mentioned in the Sutra Alamkara. In short, the Lama must be a learned as well as experienced. So we have in the Kadam tradition, the scholarly Kadam tradition, studied these texts. the 6 different texts, so such as those of the Bodhisattva Bhumi and Sutra Alamkara, Bodhisattva Charyavatara and Shiksha Samuchaya, and then those of the Jataka tale and the Udana Varga. And so these must be used as texts for study. Of course, you could be really learned, but if you don't have experience and practice, that doesn't make you a qualified teacher as such, Dharma teacher as such. And so I know the late Trishi Rinpoche, who was very close to me. I have received many teachings from him, and during our meetings, sometimes I actually we make fun, crack jokes with each other. And one time I mentioned about geishas, learned ones called geishas, and the Rinpoche immediately came up with this saying, which says, the geishas are mere flowers that flower on the trees without any fruit in the end. And therefore, you must be experienced while being scholarly, learned ones. And therefore, you should also be someone who is learned. That learning, that scholarship does not actually undermine or kill that of the being disciplined and humility. So Sogye Rinpoche was disgraced recently in America, and so he may be learned, but without any practice and experience of the teaching, therefore being abusing disciples, deceiving them. And so there were people in Taiwan and other places in Tibet also this happens. And so then the root of creating the auspicious conditions for all the excellences of this and future lives is to rely properly with effort, both in the thought and action, upon the sublime spiritual mentor who reveals the path. And so this Lama should be, a spiritual teacher, should be someone who is both learned and practitioner and experienced. Seeing this, we should never forsake him, even at the cost of life, and please him with offering of implementing his words. And so mainly following a Lama is following his words precisely. And so Rinpoche says, I, a yogi, have practiced in this manner. You who aspire to liberation, too, should do likewise. And so these 2 lines we usually switch by saying, you, a yogi, have practiced in this way, and I, who aspire to liberation, should do likewise. And so with regards to the human life, fully qualified human life, it is mentioned that it has to have 8 leisures of freedom and 10 opportunities or endowments. So to practice the Dharma, well, you should have these 18 qualifications of a human life, or qualities of a human life. So, of course, the Buddha is not here with us, but his words, his teachings are with us. And then, with regard to the teaching, we have the Vinaya tradition that has come down from the Buddha through his son Rahula and so forth, down to the present. And then we also have the teachings that has come down through the lines of our teachers, although the Buddha himself is not with us. So this life of leisure is even more precious than a wish-granting jewel. And you should actually reflect that thing, and that this life is very difficult to find, and it is very significant once you have found it. If you look at the animals, of course, there's nothing we can do except make prayers. They don't have such a precious human life. And then in the universe is something which is countless, which has countless world systems. In Italy, somebody asked me whether there are beings in other world systems or not. I replied by saying that, of course, we cannot see, even if there are beings in other world systems, we cannot see them, but we can think that there is this infinite world system in the universe. Even within the Milky Way galaxy that we live in, there are billions of stars. So this is one galaxy. There are other galaxies, infinite number of galaxies there. The more you look into the universe, into the space, you find more and more. So within this countless, infinite number of galaxies, we cannot say that human beings live only in this galaxy, Milky Way galaxy, and particularly in the solar system, and specifically on this Earth. How can we say that? So it is said that there was a Big Bang. And then later, the water was formed, and then from there the microbes developed, and then they slowly the multi-molecular structures, and then organisms formed, and so in this way human beings also developed on this earth according to evolutionary theory. So the similar kind of procedure of evolutionary evolution could happen in other galaxies as well. So we cannot say that human beings exist only on this Earth alone. When I was in Australia once, one television crew member came, a team came, and they asked me whether I believed in a dinosaur or not. So the dinosaurs lived 100 million or 200 million years ago. So they asked me whether I believe in such an animal as dinosaur. And I wondered why they were asking. And I said, I do believe in dinosaurs. But later on, I found out that the staunch Christians, some staunch Christians, conservative Christians, say that it cannot exist because the world was created only about 5,000 years ago by God. So in our text, there is hundreds of billions of world systems mentioned, but we can only pray for the others. On this earth, there are those of the birds, other animals living in water and on land, and then there are those of the flies and other microbes. Of course, 7 billion human beings are the ones. We can do something to help them, although we cannot do much to the animals. We make prayer for the peace, for the happiness of all sentient beings. If we mean by that prayer, what we need to actually think is that we should do something for the 7 billion people. Although this is what I think and what I tell people these days, because 7 billion people on this earth, whether all of them have all the 18 conditions that are mentioned in our text or not, but they are all human beings. They have this intelligence, and therefore we can do something if we put effort in helping them. And so we should reflect on how difficult it is to find such a precious human life, and also reflect on the scarcity or the rarity of finding such a human life, and the preciousness of this life, significance of this life. And then we should also think about that it's evident that we are going to die, inevitable that we are going to die. The time of our death is uncertain, and after death, nothing but the Dharma can help. We cannot say, you cannot say that you are young and you will not die. You can die any time due to certain conditions. And so, if you have left a good, wholesome imprint in your mind, developed by having a wholesome thought, you should have that imprint. If you have left quite a dense or imprint of the wholesome actions, then of course you can hope. You can have some hope for a good life in the next life. So we as human beings, we have all these negative emotions. And sometimes we consider those who are able to actually show anger and attachment more, they are more successful, but that's not the case. We take these negative emotions as if they are our nature. That's not the case. So, having all these negative emotions, we would be in a difficult situation to create the wholesome conditions for their better rebirth. And therefore, we should think that this life is impermanent, that it is that we are going to die, that death is inevitable, and so forth. And nothing but the Dharma can help. So this life of leisure and more experience and so forth, and like the empty grain husks floating in the winds, and that we must extract the essence of this human existence. There's no certainty that after death we may not be born in lower realms. The protection from such terror lies in the three jewels. So we must make firm the practice of going for refuge and ensure that its precepts are never undermined. And this in turn depends on contemplating well the black and white karmas and their effects, and on the perfect observance of ethical norms. I, a yogi, have practiced in this manner. You who aspire to liberation, should do likewise. So, of course, we do take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And taking refuge in the Buddha should not be like taking refuge by other traditions, other religious traditions, theistic traditions, in some kind of a god or higher power. Buddha is not a god. What we need to understand is we should take refuge in the actual refuge is that of the Dharma. And so the Dharma is about making transformation within ourselves by overcoming our negative emotions and avoiding negative karmas, and develop our path, experience within ourselves, which does not come through some blessing. So we cannot say, may through the blessing of the Buddha I become enlightened. This cannot happen. The Buddha appeared over 2,500 years ago. But if the Buddha's blessing could liberate us, the blessing is already there since over 2,500 years. This does not happen. So, with regard to the teachings on the Four Noble Truths, such as the suffering and its origin. I mean, we need someone who teaches them. And then to develop the path which gives rise to that of the true cessation, we need also someone who teaches this to us. This cannot happen without practice. And so the Buddha appeared over 2,500 years ago in India, and then there were the 7 successors to the Buddha, and then those of the great masters of India and also Tibet. So when we see these, when we think about those masters of the past, we feel inspired to practice their path. This in turn depends on contemplating the white and black karma and their effects, and on the practice of observance of ethical norms. So, of course, taking refuge, of course, comes about by fearing the lower realms of existence, rebirth into the lower realms of existence, and seeing that the 3 jewels can help us. But mainly, we should understand what is taught in the Brahmana Samuchaya, the salutation verse, and Brahmana Vartika, where it is mentioned the Buddha was someone who became a reliable being, an authoritative being, and became someone who realized those of the true cessation and true path. So, in order to realize those of the true cessation and true path within ourselves, we need to start from now by avoiding those of the negative things, negative actions and thoughts that we can now at this stage. So the teaching of the Buddha is mainly for those overcoming the negative emotions. So the teachings pertaining to the beings of small scope are those which restrain us from the actions of body and speech mainly. And then those of the teachings for the intermediate scope are the ones which curb, which are meant for overcoming the negative emotions. And then those of the beings of great scope, teachings being for the great scope, are to overcome even these stains left by them. So, of course, to reach Buddhahood, we need to work for life after life. So, becoming, reaching or attaining nirvana, liberation, and omniscience state, we need to do practices for many lifetimes. And therefore, we need to be able to, as Master Nagarjuna in Ratnavali says, first, we have those teachings leading to a higher rebirth. And so higher rebirth means, with regard to the human life, that of a life where you have this human intelligence. Because we need to think about emptiness in order to reach that of the nirvana or liberation. And therefore, in order to reach liberation, we also need to attain a higher rebirth, like a human rebirth like this, with intelligence. And therefore, we need to avoid the 10 unwholesome actions, 3 of mind, 4 of speech, and then 3 of body. Sorry. So the 3 of body, that unwholesome actions, such as taking life, stealing, and sexual misconducts. These are common to other religious traditions as well. Even the four actions of unwholesome actions of speech, which are telling lies, divisive talk, harsh language, and idle gossip. So these are common to other religious traditions. When I visited Christian monasteries, I found how simple a life the monastics live in their monasteries. And then with regard to the three unwholesome actions of mind, there are those of there is that of wrong view, of course, which can be interpreted according to the different religious traditions. For us as Buddhists, we say regarding that the three jewels and the law of karma does not exist are comprise those of the wrong view. In order for us to have a good rebirth in the next life, there are 16 practices mentioned. On top of the 10 avoiding 10 non-virtuous actions, avoiding drinking alcohol, and avoiding wrong livelihood, and not harming others, either directly or indirectly. And then when you give alms to beggars, you should give them respectfully. And then also respecting or helping infirm people who are infirm, and with people with disabilities, and elderly people with respect, and then also venerating those worthy of veneration, and then that of their compassion or loving kindness. So these are make up 16 on top of the 10 avoiding 10 non-virtuous actions. So, of course, when we talk about avoiding the unwholesome actions with our body, speech, and mind, those that have already been done before, what we can do is we can actually confess them. As Master Milarepa said, if you ask whether having created sinful actions or done sinful actions, whether you can actually purify that or not, yes, you can. He says, if you regret your unwholesome actions, you can purify them. And therefore, we have the practices of confession to the 35 Buddhas, the confession to the 35 Buddhas to practice as a practice of purification for. So if you strongly regret the non-virtuous actions that you have done, and also you have this determination not to repeat them, and then also following the four opponent powers, such as taking refuge and generating bodhicitta and so forth, also come under the four opponent powers. And then next, so this is up to verse number 16, we have the teachings pertaining to the beings of small scope, and from 17 now comes the teachings pertaining to the beings of intermediate scope. And so until we have attained the most qualified form to pursue, so with regard to suffering, of course,
Even animals are aware of what is known as the suffering of suffering. And the changeable suffering is something which even the non-Buddhist traditions are aware of as being unwanted. So the wish to be overcome, to be free from the contaminated pleasurable experience is there even in the non-Buddhist practitioners. And therefore, what we are talking about as suffering is the suffering which is the deeper suffering, the conditioned, pervasive conditioning, existential suffering. So, which means the psychophysical aggregates that we have now have come about from our negative emotions and karma. So, contaminated karma. And therefore, these very psychophysical aggregates themselves are the basis of suffering for us. So if we don't see this as being the nature of suffering, then this can also be a cause for our attachment, anger, and so forth. So liberation is that stage where you have overcome through the application of antidote, the stage where you have the contaminated psychophysical aggregates that we have now ceases anymore to arise. And so karma arises from our negative emotions, afflictive emotions, and these negative emotions arise through some conceptual constructs, which are called like exaggerated outlook on things, and that in turn arises from this grasping at some true existence in things. As Master Nagarjuna says in the Mulamadhyamaka Karika, and then he says this grasping can be ended by emptiness. So this last line, the final line in this verse, according to Kuno Lama Tenzin Gyaltsen, also can be interpreted two ways. One is that the understanding of emptiness leads to the ending, to end that of the negative, the grasping at true existence, and the other interpretation is that we can these negative emotions or the grasping actually dissolves within that wisdom realizing emptiness directly. And so the first interpretation is related to that of the true cessation, and the second interpretation relates to the true path. So one scientist whom I have met, first time I met, when I first met him, he was 84. And from decades of his dealing with people with psychiatric problem, who have problem because of anger, mainly, having dealt with such people, he said to me that when somebody is angry, the person actually sees the person or the object at which he or she is angry as totally negative. But 90% of that negativeness is actually our own mental projection. So this seeing things as attractive or unattractive, and then having this exaggerated outlook on them arises because they appear to have some kind of an objective existence. So when you have that grasping, clinging to such an objective existence in the attractive or unattractive nature of things, then that exaggerated outlook arises from there. This is what the scientists say even. Whereas if you are able to say that things do not exist, that they do appear in this way, but they don't exist that way, then it actually helps to reduce one's intensity of one's negative, this exaggerated outlook. And so when this is reduced, intensity of that is reduced, then it can help to reduce those of negative emotions as well. So verse number 19. So verse number 19 is the one that is referring to when he said, from here we come to the reference to to those of the beings with intermediate scope. Sorry for that mistake I made earlier. And then generating the mind is the central axle of supreme vehicle. And so here, generating the mind refers to bodhicitta. And so when you cultivate bodhicitta, you do not think of yourself alone, but you are actually thinking of all sentient beings. You think of all sentient beings and wish them to be free from suffering and to have all happiness. And this is actually complemented by two aspirations, which one is that of the aspiration to help others, and the second is this aspiration to reach Buddhahood. So the aspiration to Buddhahood must come through understanding the true nature of things. That means it must be complemented by wisdom. And so in order to reach Buddhahood, which is or enlightenment, which comes about through the purification of negativities and also becoming fully aware of everything. So we need to develop the path which purifies the negativities that are within ourselves. And the path itself is called in the nature of clear light. And so the emptiness, on the one hand, we need to understand emptiness. And on the other hand, we also need to see the clear and awareness nature of the mind, the luminous nature of the mind itself. And so on the basis of the two truths, we need to understand the Four Noble Truths, and we need to understand what is meant by that of liberation. And by understanding that, we'll be able to see how what the Buddha is. The Buddha is someone who teaches us the path and gives us the teaching from his own experience. And so, by having developed the understanding through valid knowledge, that that liberation and its enlightenment is possible, and that you wish to help others. When you wish to help others, you also need to see that it's possible to reach that goal of enlightenment for yourself and others. And therefore, you should develop this aspiration to the compassion and that of the understanding of emptiness. Now we switch to bhavana karma, the stages of meditation, developing equanimity, the root of loving kindness. The way to meditate on compassion will be taught from the outset. Begin the practice by meditating on equanimity. And so by this, you actually develop this equanimity whereby you overcome attachment towards the near and dear ones and aversion towards those whom you consider as your adversaries. So try to actualize impartiality towards all sentient beings by eliminating attachment and hatred. All sentient beings desire happiness, do not desire misery. Think deeply about how in this begin the cycle of existence, there is no one sentient being who has not been my friend and relative hundreds of times. Therefore, since there is no ground for being attached to some and hating others, I should develop mind of equanimity towards all sentient beings. Begin the meditation on equanimity by thinking of neutral person and then consider people who are friends and foes. After the mind has developed equanimity towards all sentient beings, meditate on loving kindness. Moisten the mental continuum with the water of loving kindness and prepare it as you would a piece of fertile ground. When the seed of compassion is planted in such a mind, germination will be swift, proper, and complete. Once you have irrigated the mind stream with loving kindness, meditate on compassion. And then regarding compassion, there are many types of compassion. One is wishing others to be suffering from suffering. So you need to see what suffering is. And when you find that the cause of suffering is something that can be eliminated, overcome, and there's a possibility for that, and then you will have this other compassion, which is to really help them to be free from suffering, taking that responsibility on yourself. So by thinking about suffering, when you develop the wish to, or the determination to help others free from suffering, you need to see the sentient beings and the suffering of the sentient being. So it says the compassionate mind has the nature of wishing all sentient beings to be free from suffering. Meditate on compassion for all sentient beings, because the beings in the three realms of existence are intensely tortured by the three types of suffering in various ways. The Buddha has said that heat and other types of pain constantly torture beings in the hell for a very long time. So there is the suffering of sentient beings, such as those of the hungry ghost, and then the suffering of animals, and then human beings, suffering of human beings. We can see that human beings too experience various acute kinds of pain. So we can see this on this earth, 7 billion people, because they lack the sense of caring for others. I mean, there is huge gap between rich and poor. So in the past, China, for example, used to be a socialist country, but today there is huge gap between the rich and the poor because of lack of caring of others, seeing that all human beings are equal. So if you have this sense of equality amongst all sentient beings, then you will be able to have a true socialist society. Not able to find what they want, they are resentful and harm each other. They suffer the pain of losing the beautiful things they want and conquering the ugly things they do not want, as well as the pain of poverty. So those who are inflicted by suffering, you could have compassion for them because of their suffering, but also Not only that, but you could also think of the causes that they're creating by which they're going to suffer in the future, and have compassion for them for creating the suffering, the causes of suffering for the future. There are those whose minds are bound by various fetters of disturbing emotions, like craving, desire. Others are in turmoil with different types of wrong views. These are all causes of misery. Therefore, they are always painful, like being on a precipice. And so these are talking about the suffering of suffering, and also the gods suffer the misery of so forth. And then the next paragraph says pervasive misery or pervasive suffering is. So each moment, it says, it has the nature and characteristic of momentary disintegration and pervades all wandering beings. So Vaibhashikas talk about, when they talk about impermanence, they say there is an arisal, moment of arisal, abiding, and then this disintegration, and then finally, they got decaying, and then disintegration. Whereas Sotantikas say that whatever comes into being, the very cause which has given rise to it is the cause for its destruction or disintegration. And therefore, it says that the psychophysical aggregates are subject to the disintegration due to their causes and conditions. And because of that disintegration, the nature of being disintegrated, therefore, we can see this life that has come about through our karma and delusions is in the nature of suffering. So which has this psychophysical aggregates that we have are the results of a karma and delusion, which are momentary objects as well. Therefore, see all wandering beings are immersed in great fire of misery. Think that they are all like you in not desiring misery at all. Alas, all my beloved sentient beings are in such pain. What can I do to set them free and make their suffering your own? Whether you are engaged in one-pointed meditation or pursuing your ordinary activities. So we are talking about here dealing with those of the practices that you do during the meditation session and practices during the post-meditation session. And so we usually do some purification practices, and such as making prostration and so forth. And then you sit down and do the actual practice. And whatever concentration you have developed during the meditation session, you should not lose the intensity or the influence of it even during the post-meditation session. And so meditate on pursuing ordinary, meditate on compassion at all times, focusing on all such beings and wishing that they all be free from suffering. Begin by meditating on friends and relatives. Recognize how they experience their various sufferings that have been explained. And then, having seen all sentient beings as equal with no difference between them, you should meditate on beings to whom you are indifferent. When the compassion you feel towards them is the same as the compassion you feel towards sentient friends and relatives, meditate on compassion for all sentient beings throughout the 10 directions of the universe. So it is powerful what is said in the Bodhisattva Charya Avatara is quite powerful. You should see all sentient beings as being equal in wanting happiness, not wanting suffering, and therefore develop equanimity, and then also then develop that of loving kindness and compassion towards all sentient beings. And then you see the faults of those of the self-centered attitude. And
다시 제가 사보면 될 때는 동네 구조해야 되다.
So think about the faults of self-centered attitude in various ways, and then also see the good qualities of exchanging and equality and exchanging self and others. So, of course, for some beings, it's powerful to develop bodhicitta through the sevenfold cause and effect system instruction, and for others, it's more powerful to follow that of the practice which is called equaling, exchanging self and others. So, with regard to when you develop bodhicitta, the text says, just as a mother responds to her small, beloved, and suffering child, when you develop a spontaneous and equal sense of compassion towards all sentient beings, you have perfected the practice of compassion. And this is known as great compassion. And so, you should first study and learn about this compassion, and then reflect on it through reasoning and by thinking over and over, and then you should develop the so through that you develop conviction, and then familiarize your mind with compassion, and then so that you develop what is known as similitude, experience of compassion, and then the genuine sense of compassion, and this is known as great compassion. Meditate on loving kindness begins with friends and people you are fond of. It has the nature of wishing that they meet with happiness. Gradually extend the meditation to include strangers and even your enemies. Habituating yourself to compassion, you'll gradually generate a spontaneous wish to liberate all sentient beings. Therefore, having familiarized yourself with compassion as the basis, meditate on the awakening mind of bodhicitta. So bodhicitta is of two types, conventional and ultimate. Conventional bodhicitta is the cultivation of the initial thought that aspires to attain unsurpassable and perfect consummated Buddhahood in order to benefit all wandering sentient beings after having taken the vow out of compassion to release all of them from suffering. That conventional bodhicitta should be cultivated in a process similar to that described in the chapter on moral ethics in the Bodhisattva Bhumi. Generating this mind by taking the bodhisattva vow before a master who abides by the bodhisattva precepts. So day after tomorrow we'll do the bodhisattva ceremony for cultivating bodhicitta, and also so bodhicitta ceremony will be done at the suggestion of, I think, Delor Rinpoche tomorrow, because day after tomorrow the teaching on hitting the essence through three words will be only for those of only for a few people. So are you not tired? Through conviction, gaining conviction in their teachings. And so we have been working on teaching secular ethics in secular school systems today, and therefore in America we have Emory University, who have been working on drafting a curriculum for teaching secular ethics. And then also in India, the Tata Institute of Social Sciences and others are involved in this kind of project, making curriculum on secular ethics. And so generally speaking, 6 billion people, about 6 billion people say they are religious. follower of some this or that religion. And within the religious religions, there are the two camps: one theistic religions and non-theistic religion. On the other hand, so in India, in Hinduism, for example, many different kinds of Hinduism believe in a creator God. So originally, everything was created by God, but then they also believe in past and future lives. So there are homegrown religions in India, which are theistic, and then also in the West, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are theistic religions. The believer of one creator God, and we are created just this life. So this is also very good, because when you ask what God is, the people say, the followers say that God is infinite love, an embodiment of love. And so the Creator, when it is said that the Creator is an embodiment or infinite love, we are like children of that God. So the God is like our parent, and since God is the embodiment of love and compassion, and therefore, when we say that we are created by God, such a God, it gives us this inspiration to follow the will of God, to practice love and compassion. And so, to follow God or the will of God means you need to practice love and compassion, not through the practice of by being angry. And so, therefore, these theistic religions are, if you sincerely practice them, you will really find them beneficial, because they are based on the practice of love and compassion. And so, of course, all these theistic religions have been beneficial to us for so long until now.
1 billion.
So we have 1 billion Christians, and also about a billion, over a billion Muslims, and also Hindus. Maybe there are 7 or 8 100 million, and so in China, of the 1 point something a billion people, there are 400 million Buddhists today in China. And so China becomes the most populated Buddhist, the communist country with the most population of Buddhists. And so we have many different religious traditions in the world today. And then with regard to the non-theistic religions, the first one would be the Sankhya school, which evolved around 3,000 years ago. And then within, of course, Sankhya school, there are two groups. One is theistic, the other non-theistic. So with regard to the non-theistic, religion cannot affect them. And then amongst the religions, religious people, practitioners of different religions, there are people who who are not convinced of the religious messages that are in their religious traditions. And therefore, there is this problem of even going to the length of killing other human beings in the name of religion. And therefore, to cover all the 7 billion people on this earth, we need a system of teaching, which is the secular teaching of secular ethics, which existed in India for thousands of years.
So secularism in India is understood in the sense of respecting religious traditions as well as non-believers. So this is how secularism is understood in India, whereas in the West, secularism has the connotation of disrespect or distance from the religious tradition. And during the French Revolution and Bolshevik revolution, there has been opposition to religion. But of course, if you think closely, these are not so much as we cannot say that they are against religion as such, but the religious organizations. So, because religions teach love and compassion, and no human being would oppose love and compassion. So, religious institutions were the ones that they actually were against these two revolutions. So the social system that was in place in those days was feudal system, and therefore the religious institutions have also some hands in they have influence over those rulers. And so in French Revolution, the religious institution was opposed, and also Bolshevik Revolution. So we need to differentiate between the religious institutions and the teachings of the religions and see them separate. So in Tibet also, the religion was, we almost also used the religion as a means to oppress people. So the people who were in power, the landlords, because they have connection with the religious institutions which were supporting them, backing them, and therefore during the revolutions, the two revolutions, the French and Bolshevik revolutions, there is this also the kind of it seems that the people were against religion also when they were opposing the feudal lords. So therefore, in the West, secularism has this connotation of being against religion, whereas in India, secularism doesn't have that connotation. Secularism is understood to respect religion as well as those who have no religious belief. For example, the Charvakas were the ones who were materialists. And those who were practitioners and followers of this tradition in India were, of course, their philosophical idea was criticized, but the practitioners themselves were respected as being rishis or sage. And this is the understanding of secularism, respecting believers as well as non-believers in India. And then Indian constitution itself is based on secularism. So over 1 billion people today are without any religious belief today, and it is said that about 6 billion people are with religion. Although the people do say that they follow this or that religion, but they are not sincerely following their religious tradition through.
These
are salutation verse from Abhisamaya Lankara. Salutation verses from the wisdom verses of the middle way. I prostrate to the perfect Buddha, the best of teachers, all who taught that which arises through dependent relationship is without cessation, without arising, without annihilation, without permanence, without coming, without going, without distinction, without identity, and peaceful, free from fabrications.
애니 쳐드셔 되죠.
So here in Latvia today, we have the teaching is mainly for those people who have come from Russia. The reason is Buddhism is one of the state-recognized religions of the Federation of Russia, and we have within the Russian Federation, Kalmykia, Buryat, and Tuva, who people who were following Buddhism as their traditional religion, and particularly the Buddhism that has spread to Tibet. And so when I was a child, there were hundreds of students of philosophy and Buddhist philosophy in Tibet. And so for many centuries, over maybe we may say over 1,000 years, we have this connection between the Buddhists within the Russian Federation and Tibet. And therefore, I'm here to explain give teaching on Buddhism and explain the text that we are going to go through. Whereas in the West, of course, I do explain about psychology, mind, emotions in the West, which are academic subjects. And recently, I was in Germany and met with scientists, and we had discussions on philosophy and science of mind. And I do not try to explain Buddhism as such in these areas, because different countries and different regions have their own ancestral, traditional religions, and therefore I always consider it better for those people in the West to keep to their own tradition. Because of the complications that happens to people, there may be problems people would face. So some Westerners who came to India and then tried to convert themselves to Buddhism, but later on they had complications, and therefore it's better for people to keep to their own traditional religious traditions. I have Father Wayne. I knew a Christian father, Father Wayne, who was very interested in Buddhism. So we were very good friends, and we shared teachings on love, tolerance, and also compassion, and also single-pointed meditation. One day he asked me about emptiness, and I told him, "Don't ask that question. This is not your business. This is a unique philosophical concept of Buddhism." And so I frankly told him, because we were very close to each other, I frankly told him, because the reason is that when we talk about dependent origination, everything is dependently arisen, we need to talk about all things being like an illusion, and therefore I thought that thinking about emptiness might hinder his own belief in an absolute God. And therefore it's better to stay within one's own traditional religion, but amongst the thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands and millions of people in the different countries, there, of course, may be people with disposition to the teaching of the Buddha. And so those may be exceptions. And so people could take interest in Buddhism and And having taken interest in Buddhism, they find Buddhism to be more suitable to them. And the traditional religion may not be so effective, they feel, not so effective for them. And therefore, even in such cases, it's a different, it's an exception that they could, that they take up Buddhism as their religion. But while doing so, they must not disrespect their own traditional religion, because the traditional religion in the West, Judeo-Christian religions, have been really beneficial to their followers. And then in this hall also, there may be people who are traditional Buddhists and then those who are new to Buddhism. But we need to always keep respect to our traditional religions, your traditional religions. I personally do respect all religions. So through mutual respect amongst the religious traditions, it's very important for us to develop harmony amongst the different religions in today's world. It is very unfortunate that we have people engaging in killing other people in the name of religion. In Tibet also, there were fightings amongst the different religious traditions between red hat and yellow hat sect and so forth. And so these are really unfortunate. And so this, of course, happens in other regions. And so even if you may have adopted Buddhism as your religion, you should still respect your own traditional religion. And so the question here about religion is, what does religion mean? We are in the 21st century, in a period where there is very high advancements in science and technology. And so we need to explain whether religion is something relevant or not today. Do we need religion in today's world? Of course, there are many intellectuals and many institutions, academic institutions, but most of the learning and education that we have today are more or less oriented towards that of the faith. Those of the material development alone. And then with regard to religions, most of the religions also are based on faith alone. Whereas in India, we have tradition of making transformation in our mind. So that doesn't mean we should have new kinds of mind as such, but the very mind that we have now, which is full of all these negative thoughts and emotions, and then chain reaction within them, within ourselves, and we need to transform this from within, not through some prayer or not through some blessings, but through critical thinking. And so how do we do that is with regard to anger, arrogance, and pride, and also self-centered attitude. And there is this grasping and attachment to oneself, very strong attachment to oneself. And these causes disturbance in our mind. And so on the one hand, it's caused by the self-attachment. And then on the other hand, we make this distinction between enemies and those of adversaries and our friends, and then have all these emotions, emotional reactions. So in other words, religion teaches the practice of love and compassion. Even in the case of theistic religions, those believers in the Creator God also teach in order to strengthen the practice of love and compassion. There is teaching of tolerance, forgiveness, contentment, and so forth. And so all these different religious traditions are the practice to reduce at least to those of our negative emotions like anger and hatred and so forth. So the educational system, which is more or less oriented towards the material development, cannot actually cause this transformation within ourselves to overcome our negative emotions like anger, attachment, and so forth. Of course, people do find some relief from by taking drugs, tranquilizers, and so forth, but cannot transform our mind, overcome our anger, and so forth. So the existing modern education system is more or less oriented towards those of the its material development. Modern education, of course, started in the West, and through the development of technology and science, when they began in the West, the religious institutions were the educational institutions as well in the beginning. But then as science and technology, arithmetic and so forth developed further and further, and there's this technological advancement, so the religious traditions, the religious institutions, which were the educational institutions in the beginning, didn't become sufficient, and therefore the educational institutions separately developed in the West. And so with regard to the taking care of the inner world of our mind, it was left to the religious institutions, and the rest of the fields of learning, like arithmetic and so forth, were left to the educational institutions that developed separately from the religious traditions, religious institutions. And as time went by, as people lost faith in religion more and more, then the religious traditions impact or influence on people with regard to teaching morality and so forth was not sufficient. And the educational institutions themselves did not have any education on morality, ethics, and therefore, in modern existing education lacks the teaching on moral principles and love and compassion. So, of course, in order to fix this problem, religion alone cannot cover all 7 billion people. And because over 1 billion people of the 7 billion are the non-believers. And so because they do not believe in religion,